Welcome to Cyber Genius, where we dive into the exciting world of technology. Today, we're exploring the incredible applications of augmented reality AR and virtual reality VR beyond gaming. Hey everyone, get ready to be amazed as we discover how AR and VR are transforming our daily lives. Visual explanation of augmented reality and its key features. Visual explanation of virtual reality and its key features. Timeline showcasing the evolution of AR and VR technologies. Overview of popular AR and VR devices, including headsets and smart glasses. Discussion on development platforms for creating AR and VR experiences. Examples of how AR and VR are revolutionizing education and training. Examples of how AR and VR are being used in healthcare for diagnosis, treatment, and training. Examples of how AR and VR are transforming architectural design and visualization. Examples of how AR and VR are enhancing the retail shopping experience. Examples of how AR and VR are changing the way we experience travel and tourism. Examples of how AR and VR are revolutionizing marketing campaigns and brand experiences. Examples of how AR and VR are creating immersive entertainment experiences. Examples of how AR and VR are enhancing sports training, analysis, and fan engagement. Examples of how artists are using AR and VR to create interactive and immersive artworks. Examples of how AR and VR are transforming social media platforms. Examples of how AR and VR are preserving and presenting cultural heritage. Examples of how AR and VR are changing the way news stories are told. Examples of how AR and VR are facilitating remote collaboration and productivity. Examples of how AR and VR are enhancing fitness and wellness experiences. Examples of how AR and VR are revolutionizing the fashion industry. Examples of how AR and VR are transforming the automotive industry, including design, manufacturing, and sales. Examples of how AR and VR are changing the way properties are bought, sold, and visualized. Examples of how AR and VR are being used for environmental education and conservation efforts. Examples of how AR and VR are being used for mental health therapy and treatment. Examples of how AR and VR are enhancing language learning experiences. Examples of how AR and VR are being used in emergency response and disaster management. Examples of how AR and VR are improving accessibility for people with disabilities. Examples of how AR and VR are improving agricultural practices and crop management. Examples of how AR and VR are transforming industrial design and prototyping. Examples of how AR and VR are being used for social justice, advocacy, and awareness. Examples of how AR and VR are being used for wildlife conservation and research. Examples of how AR and VR are being used for parenting education and child development. Examples of how AR and VR are enhancing music creation and performance. Examples of how AR and VR are being used for disaster preparedness training. Examples of how AR and VR are reconstructing historical events and sites. Examples of how AR and VR are being used for renewable energy, education and awareness. Examples of how AR and VR are being used for governance and civic engagement. Examples of how AR and VR are enhancing astronomy education and exploration. Examples of how AR are enhancing culinary experiences and cooking education. Examples of how AR are being used in legal practice for courtroom simulations and evidence presentation. Examples of how AR and VR are being used in journalism for immersive storytelling and investigative reporting. Examples of how AR and VR are being used for diversity and inclusion training. Jinta Workplace. Examples of how AR and VR are being used in urban planning for city visualization and community engagement. Examples of how AR and VR are being used for water conservation education and awareness. Examples of how AR and VR are being used to assist refugees with language learning, cultural adaptation, and job training. Examples of how AR and VR are being used for conflict resolution and peace building. Examples of how AR and VR are being used to improve transportation systems and driver training. Examples of how AR and VR are being used in journalism for immersive storytelling and investigative reporting. Examples of how AR and VR are being used for diversity and inclusion training in the workplace. Examples of how AR and VR are being used in urban planning for city visualization and community engagement. Examples of how AR and VR are being used for water conservation, education and awareness. Examples of how AR are being used to assist refugees with language learning, cultural adaptation, and job training. Examples of how AR and VR are being used for conflict resolution and peace building. Examples of how AR and VR are being used to improve transportation systems and driver training. Examples of how AR and VR are facilitating remote collaboration among teams and organizations. Examples of how AR and VR technologies are aiding in disaster response efforts, including search and rescue missions. Examples of how AR and VR are fostering cultural exchange and understanding between different communities and societies. Examples of how AR and VR technologies are being used for philanthropic purposes. such as fundraising and awareness campaigns. Examples of how AR and VR are being used as tools for art therapy and mental health treatment. Examples of how AR and VR technologies are enhancing remote learning experiences for students of all ages. Examples of how AR and VR technologies are being used to aid in the rehabilitation and care of injured or orphaned wildlife. Examples of how AR and VR technologies are revolutionizing the construction industry. From design to project management, examples of how AR are being used to raise awareness about environmental issues and inspire action. Examples of how AR and technologies are being used to promote sustainable practices in the fashion industry. Examples of how AR and VR are being used to digitally preserve and protect cultural heritage sites. Examples of how AR and VR technologies are being used to preserve endangered languages and promote linguistic diversity. Examples of how AR and VR technologies are being used to assist in the recovery and rebuilding efforts following natural disasters. Examples of how AR and VR are being used to raise awareness about endangered species and promote conservation efforts. Examples of how AR and VR technologies are being used to promote sustainable farming practices and food security.